Welcome to Smith Weekly Discussions, an occasional program for our members of Smith Weekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position, along with your favorite beverage, to enjoy the discussion. We remind our audience to examine our show notes attached to each of our shows to better understand how our program functions. Before we get into our discussion today, we want to say thanks for questions coming from our audience of Smith Weekly, including Edward S., Jared W., Ryan S., and Mark R. On the program today, we've got a new guest and returning company joining us. Mr. Luke Norman is here with us for this episode. Luke is the chairman of U.S. Gold Corp, a Wyoming-focused gold project developer that is advancing the conventional open pit CK gold project towards construction. Under the existing feasibility study for the project, mining operations are expected to produce approximately 85,000 gold equivalent ounces over the initial 11-year mine life at an estimated all-in sustaining cost of about 1,785 US dollars per gold equivalent ounce. US Gold is listed on the NASDAQ under the symbol USAU. Mr. Norman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
Yeah, Luke, it's good to have you on the program for the first time and, of course, get an update on U.S. Gold, of which it's been many years since we spoke to the company, and it has transformed substantially since under your work and also the work of the team that is there backing you. Well, you are new to the program. First, as customary, why don't we start off here by you giving us your background and experience in the junior natural resource sector?
Yeah, absolutely. So, gosh, I'm going to age myself here. Around 99, 2000, I kind of watched the dot-com bubble starting to unfold, and I felt that there was going to be a mass transference of sort of wealth and investment into physical assets, but I thought primarily that would be gold. I felt that the fiat currency system was already well under pressure back then. Of course, the original gold run from 1970 through 80 was because people never believed that the fiat currency was going to work. The oil dollar was going to fail at some point in time. So anyway, I picked up on that mantra and I started getting into a couple of small juniors. They were grossly underfunded. No one wanted to hear about them. I went out on the trek around. Of course, I live up in the Northwest, up in British Columbia, Vancouver in particular area, and started talking to brokers, and a couple of them offered me an opportunity to come and work with them directly. So I ended up working at Canaccord Capital for about 5 years. And that was right at the set off of the last real true secular bull market in precious metals, right? So I started working in that environment. I'm financing more and more juniors, and I started to recognize more and more that there was a real shortage of quality management. So around 2005, I decided to step out of Canaccord and pursue the other side of the business, which is kind of running and managing these projects. I picked up on one in particular in Nevada, ran with that junior company. Again, the underlying management didn't really seem to want to stack up to the hopes and expectations of the investors in the company. So I managed to extract one of their assets and start a company called Gold Standard Ventures with my business partner then, Jonathan Ord. And it was an extremely successful exploration story in Nevada. And I just stuck with my kind of focus in around Nevada for the better part of the last 2 decades, which really brought about US Gold Corp, the onset being, of course, in Nevada. So again, from the brokerage side, the banking side of the business over to management, but no geological background, but corporate finance mainly.
Well, Luke, I would suspect that after decades in this business, you've been forced to learn some of the geology.
Oh, yes.
You've seen it so much. Yeah, I remember Gold Standard. You just reminded me. I remember the times of that company, and I should know who it's under today, but there was an M&A transaction, and that is, I believe, still being advanced towards a mine.
Yeah.
A long history here, and certainly Nevada is an interesting jurisdiction, and just as much so, in my opinion, over at this desk, that Wyoming's a fantastic jurisdiction for the extractive industries. And what you guys have been able to put together with CK Gold, another nice milestone here. You guys are moving ahead.
But yeah, you're right. We just really caught it all. The stars aligned for us, certainly on timing. Not at the beginning, but as this has evolved, absolutely. And just to your quick question there, it was actually Orla, which is one of the Pierre Lassonde group of companies. Orla was the one that transacted on Railroad and Gold Standard.
That's right. And now Orla is now being taken over by Equinox. Well, before we jump into U.S. Gold Corp, why don't we have you just give us a little bit of thoughts on the gold market here in terms of market events, if you want to go there. Otherwise, investor sentiment out there for gold project development companies in the United States.
Yeah, well, look, I've been, again, a firm believer in gold relative to the fiat system. I just feel that the amount of money, the dilutionary event of this constant monetary supply should reflect over to gold. So I'm not a guns and protectionist type. Hey, the whole world's going to end and you have to own gold. But I certainly think it's a great way to be able to protect yourself against the fiat system as it does unravel in front of us. Certainly did not see the price movement that I don't think any of us, we all hoped and wished we would see and felt that it should occur. But seeing the price movement, the price in gold over the last 18 months has been, yeah, jaw dropping. Where I think it's going, I think it's got, given that it has made this major tectonic shift, I think now it has a heck of a lot more legs. If we had just continued to flirt in around 2000 and poke its nose up towards 3 and back off to 2, I would have thought it's still not really being taken seriously as an asset base. Seeing gold move itself into the $5,000 range, settle here in the mid to late fours is very encouraging that, hey, there are people out there still with some common sense.
Big lack of that out there these days, Luke, as you and I were discussing offline just pre coming into the recording here. Certainly, it's great to see this consolidation. And I think with the price in the 4,500, 4,700 range per ounce USD, I think we also are in the stages of seeing a lot more activity in gold price and upside. Whereas, much of the last decade we've waited around. I mean, there's been some good opportunities out there, don't get me wrong, during that period of time, but certainly we're in that stage where we should see shorter periods of time and much more action in the market. But we'll see how this continues to develop. But we have just about all the ingredients you can have, and even more so now, even worse, whether it be leadership, whether it be financial crisis and how people thought back then in 2008 versus the status of the balance sheet in certain countries, namely the U.S., you would just shake your head even worse how things are going here. It's just really the mismanagement of everything. But we'll leave that topic for another program and stick on U.S. gold. Why don't we shift into the company updates? The company recently released a feasibility study for the CK Gold Project in Wyoming. Walk us through the key components of that study, and then we'll jump into some more specifics.
Yeah, sure. And, if you don't mind, Andrew, I might even just touch on a little bit of the legacy of how we got to that point, because it is quite interesting and very relative to the company and part of its ongoing evolution. But as I mentioned, the Nevada aspect of the company have a very large exploration project in Nevada, and that was originally the flagship of the company, a project by the name of Keystone. And it was, we went through 18 and 19 where there was absolutely zero interest in the marketplace. And you sort of hinted at that earlier. There's still success stories that can occur during these really bearish phases. Great Bear is an easy one to point to, for example. But we were sitting on this wonderful drill hole story that was just not gathering any of the excitement from the marketplace. And sitting within our portfolio was the CK Gold Project, or Copper King. CK is an acronym for Copper King, and that is now our flagship project. And in 2020, I assisted in pivoting the company completely from being a pure explorer to becoming a pre-developer. And I'm telling you, there's a very boring and tough time of the industry, and we will refer to the Lassonde curve at some point later in the discussion. But we came into it, and the project was essentially a science test. That's how I refer to exploration projects until they've established a real meaningful resource/reserve. Well, we had a loosely defined resource on a project that I felt was uncomfortably close to a state park in Wyoming, just outside of Cheyenne. And it didn't have, the big high splashy grade that one usually hopes for when you're getting your shoulder behind it. But I spoke to a friend of mine who is now the CEO of our company, George B. And George had built some of the largest gold mines on the planet as mine builder and manager for Barrick. So he took a look at the project and said, you're crazy. We should go after this, and it will be permitted, and it's going to be a cash cow. So that was 2020 in the state. Within 4.5 years, we took it from a science project to a fully engineered, reserved backed, ready to go gold mine. And we took it through the full suite of permitting. This project is now, as you've seen in the definitive feasibility study that was just released, and we'll get into, fully permitted, ready to go gold and copper project in North America, which is very rare. And it's rare because permitting in North America has become a nightmare. All these projects in permitting purgatory. So yeah, we are now a pre-developer, I guess we'll say, but this project is already, we've commenced, the haul road into the project. It's essentially underway. Yeah, that's where it stands.
Luke, thank you for that. Appreciate the background there. Certainly, you're right. There's very few projects. If you just look U.S. domestically, whether you look at Fast 41 permitting or what have you, and some of the federal programs, the handful of projects that are out there of at least of some scale, they're very few. And then, of course, you and I both know the permitting regime needs to be completely wiped out and reconfigured properly, without a doubt. Another conversation you and I could spend hours on. But yeah, very good information leading up to this. So you guys have put out this feasibility study. Walk us through some of those highlights of that feasibility study, and then we'll talk schedule after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you had mentioned that it's an 85,000 ounce producer. That kind of gets confused through the definitive. When you complete a definitive feasibility study, what you do is you take all of your engineering work. So again, George B., who's built gold mines all over the planet, he brought in a whole slew of his old contacts through contracts and contracted, type relationships, and got us to a point where we recognize how valuable this project is, how economically viable it is. But then you hand all that information off to third parties, and they complete the definitive feasibility. You have a little bit of input, but the way we actually see it mapping out is it'll be closer to 100,000 ounce producer, and it'll take just under 10 years. And that's, again, just based on the reserve. We have a 1.6 million ounce gold equivalence reserve, but the deposit itself continues well beyond the shell of that reserve. We think it's realistically, well, we don't think, we know, we've seen it with drill evidence, that realistically the deposit's twice that size. So you're looking at about a 3 million ounce deposit. 1.6 million of the ounces are already there, contained in the definitive. And we ran the numbers on a base case. So that's how you do it, of a gold price. So our gold price for the definitive feasibility study was $3,250. And it showed a discounted post-tax NPV of about $630 million. Now, keep in mind, our market cap right now today is around $260 million or so. So, we're trading at just around a third of our NPV and just under a 30% IRR. So, very robust economics. And when you start looking at $4,500 gold, the economics, of course, just hockey stick from there. You're looking at a $1.2 billion post-tax NPV and close to 40% IRR, or sorry, close to 45% IRR. So again, far from a marginal asset by any stretch of the imagination.
Luke, thank you for that. And I was trying to stick with the 85,000 because I knew you guys were going to demonstrate upside and shortly after expand and, of course, beat 85,000, come in over 100.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk just a little bit more about the expansion and exploration potential of this project post ramp up, post cash flows. I know you guys are going to go after that later on once the project's built out, but certainly it's looking like a very good project here. The feasibility study looks good, and of course, the market conditions are such that going to have some very nice cash flows come off of this. And I suspect, of course, the market will start to provide some respect, maybe through some of those construction phases, things get ramped up, et cetera, financing in hand completely, those types of milestones, which of course investors start to come in and look harder at what's happening here with the company, which you guys are on the cusp of that right now. Near term objectives. I suspect you guys are going to be looking to make a final investment decision of some kind here soon. Financing package, construction moving at site. You already mentioned you guys are already doing some pre-work activities there, pre-construction activities at site already. Just talk a little bit about the schedule for those milestones.
Yeah.
And then also roughly, I know this is a little bit out still, but when you would expect to see startup and commissioning potentially and then
Yep.
ramp up to first gold.
Yeah. Well, I missed one of the key variables that I should have included, of course, when you asked me to, summarize the definitive feasibility, which is, of course, capex. How much is going to cost to build said project, right? It's about a $400 million all-in capex, which is very low relative to that production rate. When I look at similar assets that maybe have 3 times the production rate, but they have 4 or 5 times the capex. So the production decision has been made that that was made really as soon as we got the permits and we understood that this was economically viable. Function of the definitive feasibility study, of course, is to now execute on the full suite of development capital. So raising the 400 million. How do you do it? Well, we're in a pretty serious marketplace right now with very few assets out there permitted and ready to go for development. So a lot of capital chasing few opportunities. So the $400 million we expect, I'll be mindful with my words here, should be a vast majority debt laden. This thing lends itself very nicely to debt, with a relatively small equity component tied into it. We're very stingy on equity dilution around the company and have been. You can recognize that with just looking at our current share structure, of course, which we will get into greater depth. But we only have 16.5 million shares outstanding. So, in the space of 5 years, with all that pre-work that's gone in, the dilution has occurred. We've raised upwards of $90 million to get ourselves to this point right now, and 30 of that is in cash. So 60 million into the project, pre-development, engineering, and of course permitting. That dilution's been and gone. So now with the $400 million full development suite to be raised, but we expect in very short order, we will be up and producing within about an 18-month time frame. And there's a very simple mining operation, and logistically, you could not get a better location for a build out like this. So no one's expecting any massive cost overruns or any of that. It's just a pure open pit, crush, grind, float, and we sell a concentrate off site. So a very quick transfer from being a pre-developer to a producer on this project.
With the construction finance package, so 18 months, I'm assuming that's basically your build time. And then with the financing package, two things. When would you expect to complete that package? Would it be this year? Would it go into 2027? And then what are you thinking on components of that package? It sounds like quite a bit of debt. We know that there's definitely some institutions out there looking to offer very low interest debt out there, especially to this industry now. The equity component, we know that there's going to be some equity. And of course, we think that that's important to align, folks that want to come in and enjoy some of that equity upside, which will happen. And then also the potential for royalty offtake. How do you want to put that together, and what would be the timing on the financing package?
I'll start at the beginning and then we'll get to that royalty offtake, which I think is unattractive to equity investors. You really cap your stock, so it's not the ideal way to go about it. But no, certainly won't be stretching into next year. And my kind of experience and view of how things are coming along, this is a multi-month undertaking, really. We've already received so many term sheets and offers of capital for the project. It is now with, the definitive feasibility numbers, of course, only came out about 5 or 6 weeks ago. But the actual SK 1300, which is because we're a US listed domiciled company, we don't actually operate under NI 43101, which traditionally people are more familiar with. SK 1300 is very similar, but more stringent. You don't get to talk about resources. You only get to discuss reserves in those reports. That actual report on the definitive feasibility study actually just got signed off. It's just about to be circulated to the lenders, plus a slew of other people showing interest in the project. So timelines on finance, I expect to be quite short. Again, lots of capital chasing and opportunity that's very well healed in terms of its engineering and prospectivity. So not a long lead time for capital.
Just with the debt side of it, I just wanted to ask you because it came up here. We've seen a little bit more bond issuance recently. Would you guys utilize a bond or no bond on this?
Initially, we'll probably go through the traditional sort of methods of a debt to equity ratio. Those ratios have changed dramatically even over the last 3 years or so. They used to be more, a 60 to 60% debt, 40% equity type situation. Now, we're looking at term sheets and offers in the 80% debt, 20% equity range, which we're definitely more, again, interested in, because you can then take that established debt as you get closer to production and transfer it over into some sort of bond issuance. And now keep in mind, the state of Wyoming, where we're located, has there's precedents ahead of us that they will put up to 50% of capex forward by way of a municipal bond. So we're exploring all of these options. We're not really pursuing any federal grant money or federal debt, simply because, we'll get into the weeds on this, but we are on state ground in the state of Wyoming. So we only dealt with the state of Wyoming through the permit process, the Department of Environmental Qualities. So we didn't have to deal with the BLM. We did not have to deal with the Army Corps of Engineers, which is Waterways of Americas, which these are two of the biggest sort of federal tie-ups right now for any permitting action going on in the US. So we were fortunate enough with state ground to be able to get around that. But now if we went for federal capital, we would have to bring in the federal agencies and bureaucracies. So no interest in doing that. It will be pure debt held against the project initially. Equity component could include of a hypothetical stream on our one of the components of it. The deposit, I called it a gold copper project. Actually, there is a silver component to it as well. It doesn't sound like a heck of a lot, but over the 10 years or 11 years of mine life, we managed to harvest 3 million ounces of contained silver, for example, and the economics on that don't pop out. But 3 million ounces at, say, even $50 an ounce right now is a heck of a lot of capital that we could maybe tap into as well. So I don't want to get everyone too confused, but we are looking at a whole different variation of opportunities for debt, but we're going to make it as friendly as possible to the equity holders. Why? Because we're equity holders in our own company.
Absolutely. And we'll get into that in just a moment. Actually, get over to capital structure and administrative. Just follow-up thoughts there. Certainly Wyoming, it's good to see the state put together some of these programs. I think the state definitely has some fairly smart people still running things there, and they understand the importance of natural resource industry within the state. So it's good to see the state offer that up. Of course, I agree with you. I think I would probably try to avoid the Fed side of things with respect to financing. Of course, we know there's plenty of options. And Luke, you and I both know there's no shortage of financiers in DC, and certainly no shortage of stock buyers in DC. But yeah, very good stuff there. Potential for a silver stream, a copper stream. That opens the door really to some other groups out there that want to look at that are in the stream side of things for those small byproduct, but material to the
Yes.
project, and very much important. On capital structure here, you already talked a little bit about balance sheet. Just reconfirm that cash position and see how that carries the company in 2026. Let us know what you're thinking on that. And then, of course, shares on issue. Remind us one more time of that. It's a tight capital structure here. And then also just the major shareholders, including yourself and management.
Yes, certainly. So we currently have 30 million US in treasury. That's a meaningful amount of capital, sorry, again, relative to the fact that all the pre-work is done. Now we're just looking at project finance. So there's 30 million in treasury. We have a pretty low draw in terms of, we don't have a a huge employee base that we need to concern ourselves with. The development and build out of this project is going to be, you heard me use the phrase earlier, gig employment. We have that luxury because we're 20 miles outside of the capital of Wyoming, Cheyenne, and just about 10, 12 miles north of the Colorado border, right off the State Highway 80. So we're not building man camps or any equipment storage facilities, any of that stuff. If we need an electrical engineer, they're coming from their home in the morning, packing lunch, coming in and getting the job done and heading home at night. No fly in, fly out, any of that sort of stuff. So logistically, it lends itself tremendously, obviously, to not being a huge draw on treasury. 16.5 million shares outstanding currently, with a fully diluted just over 20 million shares. But if you bring in the fully diluted, of course, you'd be adding about another 45 million in cash into treasury. So we'd be sitting on 20 million shares out, but 75 plus million dollars in treasury. So very, again, unique cap structure. We just did a round in December of last year that brought in the key institutions. Prior to that, everything had been essentially done non-brokered with a lot of friends and insider capital. The 25 plus years I've spent in the industry, I've got to meet and know a lot of people. So whilst we averted having to require bankers involved in the process, that did orphan us a little bit from coverage. We now have good coverage out of Toronto. Bay Street, of course, being really the preeminent analyst coverage that one needs for a junior mining company, especially one that is sitting on the NASDAQ exchange, right? We are domiciled and purely listed in the US. We have no Canadian exposure other than, me being a director and insider of the company, and a couple of other directors as well. So very tight. We brought in Mackenzie and Franklin Templeton, Libra, Sprott. Eric Sprott was already a shareholder of ours. So we did that, but then some very large private individuals. We have two different guys actually out of the Bay Area in San Francisco that combined own in excess of 20% of the company. And beyond that, maybe another 10% of the company is held within, close friends and associates out of that Bay Area. Management and insiders are good for around 15% of the company. That may be a bit hefty now. We did do that dilutionary, or we did do a raise and take a little bit of dilution back in December. I've been an equity investor in this company since day dot, so I have probably a much higher capital base than I should have. Usually that's not the case, of course. Insiders usually have these, penny shares that they're using and trumpeting to everyone else to buy at higher prices. I've participated in financings pretty much all the way along until I became the chairman of the company. In the US, it's very different to Canada. They actually kind of frown upon insiders participating on any discounted round of financing. So I've missed out on being able to keep myself pro rata over the last couple of years, but hey, that's part of the process. Long story short, we got a very, aside from tight share structure, very strong retail component around the company, and then some of the biggest name institutions on the planet just giving us that validation of our efforts to date.
Absolutely. Yeah, Luke, thank you for covering that off and the good work so far to bring this ahead. And of course, you guys got lots more work yet to do, but it'll be coming quite quickly. Just with some of the key staff, you've already mentioned a couple names as we've been talking here, but just any other key staff at the company and what they bring to the table to support financing and construction of the project.
Well, actually, one of the highlight slides we have on our presentation online that, of course, anyone can find, usgoldcorp.com. I used to have it on most of my presentations as a tail slide, but it is the management directors. We've all been in this industry for a large number of years, and we're all very acutely aware of the importance of adding shareholder value, of doing up rounds, of creating shareholder value, and ultimately managing companies, managing projects, and creating an end date, whether it be for this company. Of course, the intent is to develop it, put it into production, and generate a ton of cash flow relative to our shares outstanding. But also, you've got to appreciate through this evolutionary process of now the definitives out, now we're going into project finance, is a lot of interest from an M&A perspective. You know, one of the only permitted projects sitting there ready to go in North America, proximate 100,000 ounce per annum producer. You can imagine that's brought a lot of eyeballs our way in the last month or two or three from a merger acquisition perspective. So yeah, it's going to be exciting times.
The project is permitted. Talk about Wyoming as a mining jurisdiction. Of course, we're already quite familiar with it, but for the audience, some of the new audience, talk a little bit about that. And then also, as well, how supportive the local community is to see the project become a local economic generator just outside of Cheyenne.
Well, you know, being 20 miles outside of town, we had to have a lot of community involvement because the chance I mentioned as well, of course, it's close proximity to a state park. So we had to be very mindful of keeping the community up to speed right from the onset. So we hired a local who's very familiar with the political landscape in Wyoming, Jason Beggar. He's on our team, and he established straight away, you know, for really gaining that social license, that social approval, we set up an entirely standalone website that got into the right into the weeds of, okay, the style of the method of mining. Are we going to be using cyanide? No, we're not using cyanide, by the way, but what is the blasting impact going to be like? And we did all sorts of seismic studies, air quality through that permit process, all the different things. As these variables came about, we put them out to public domain. We would have very frequent town hall meetings, you know, inviting people in, come in, ask you questions, you know, just random questions. So when we went through the permit phase, which again was all in state, 20 miles away in the state of Wyoming, in the township of Cheyenne, it was very open to the community. So the permits themselves then go through an actual public disclosure process where they're put in the local newspaper, they're put out online, and that allows people to come in and object to the project. And through all the permits that we received, which includes ultimately the permit to mine, but air quality, wastewater management, particular one that's just, you know, unique to where we are, which is called a industrial sightings permit. We received no formal objection from anyone, no NGOs, anything. So tremendous support from the local community. We participate in a rodeo every year. They've got the second biggest rodeo to the Calgary Stampede, is outdoor rodeo anyway, is in Cheyenne, Wyoming. So we're there, we're very visible and open, and you know, our offices are just kitty corner to the Department of Environmental Qualities, who are the warden of the permit process. So yeah, we've had just tremendous support there. And now keep in mind, yeah, we know that it's a resource state, but we're going to be the first hard rock mine. We are the first hard rock mine permitted in 100 years in Wyoming. So it's predominantly been coal and trona, and of course we know uranium and all sorts of other oil and gas. But we're going to be the first gold mine in Wyoming in 100 years.
Luke, that's an interesting point to bring up. I appreciate you covering that. Definitely, it has a lot of other things happening there in Wyoming, but precious metals, yeah, this will be interesting. It's opening up the gate towards obviously further exploration for precious metals.
A lot going on. Yeah,
Yeah,
we're associated and friends with a number of people now, and you know, people who are coming interstate and start talking to the DEQ, which is Department of Environmental Quality, of course, the DEQ about the process. They go, call US Gold Corp. They'll tell you how to do it.
good to be setting a precedent there and getting that permit in place. And you guys are on a very quick track here and not a lot of milestones left to cover to get into that production and get into that first gold. And of course, I'm sure Wyoming's going to very much appreciate you guys being there generating that
Well,
economic activity.
yeah, and not just the economic activity, Andrew. There's actually a whole big sidebar to this project that we don't shed a lot of light on these days because, you know, too much information, people get lost in the weeds. But the way we see it right now is post-production, the pit is going to be tied into the adjoining state park and actually be used as a water reservoir to tie into their pre-existing reservoir network, save the state, the township of Cheyenne and Laramie in the region of probably close to $200 million. Otherwise, they have to revamp their existing network of reservoirs because they're grossly under capacity. So we actually leave a legacy of essentially a green mining project, a huge advantage to the local community and an extension of a park.
Certainly water resources are going to be important in this for irrigation or even potentially for domestic water use. That's fantastic. That's a good little add there too. So looking forward to seeing that advance as well here as you guys move forward, and then long-term plans with the state there with respect to that water resource. So a little bit on the expansion of the project. Just talk, you covered that a little bit earlier, but just talk about the exploration upside, the
Yes.
expansion potential. You guys plan to attack this, I'm sure, after cash flow starts coming in and you guys have excess capital to go after demonstration of that expansion. What does that roughly look like at this point in your view?
Yeah, well, the beauty of that expansion is it's really predominantly just continuing following the ore system to depth. So it's not massively invasive from a surface usage perspective. It's just continuing, broadening the size of the pit. And I mean, right now under the reserve, it's about an 86-acre at surface pit. You're talking about adding about 30% to go after what we envisage. Well, not envisage, we see it again. SK 1300, it's a little bit more challenging how you refer to blue sky or resources, but we have drill evidence that there's upwards of another million to a million and a half, million for sure, but million and a half ounces of gold and copper mineralization that just continue to depth. So as you broaden the pit, you continue to follow that mineralization down. And then there are geological perspectives beyond that too, that we kept. Well, I'll touch on what the geological perspective being that this might just be a show or a symptom of a much bigger system underlying it. I mean, we're talking, this is a porphyry system that we're harvesting. They do not stand alone generally, and there's a very good chance that this is actually just an indication of a much larger porphyry at depth. Now, you might be thinking, well, then why wouldn't you have gone and looked at that hypothesis and drilled deeper holes back in the day? Well, the market from 2020 through 2024 was still abhorrently bad. Capital was tough to find. We had to draw a line in the sand. We figured 10 years of production, 1.6, 1.7 million ounces of gold equivalents was a good enough starting point to see, hey, is this economically viable? Yes, box ticked. Hey, can we permit this? So we didn't go chasing ounces. In hindsight, had I known the market would be in this spot that it's in today, I think we would have probably chased more ounces. But again, it's not going to have a massive environmental impact, as that mineralization is just a continuation of depth within what we have, and then hunting for a potentially another porphyry below or bigger sister to it. So a lot of upside, absolutely. Will we be able to recognize it immediately? Clearly not. But I think this project's going to have legs well beyond the 10-year mine life within our reserve, within our definitive feasibility.
I think it was probably the right move to go where you guys have been going here, and that is seek to the production profiles there. It makes sense. Move it forward, get the cash flow. The market is certainly rewarding still the cash flowers first and foremost.
Yeah.
Developers, of course, and that will spill into some of the exploration, but really that cash flow demonstration, the ability to operate, I think is still gathering the most premium right now, even in this market. I mean, you look at the majors, you look at the mid tiers out there, and you look at their cash flows based on the current gold price, et cetera. I mean, still early stages of this bull cycle. And so to me, it makes sense, get those cash flows in place that eliminates potential for any further dilution. Then you guys can demonstrate the further potential of the project. And then, of course, go after your pipeline of projects, which actually coming right into now. Just as we wrap up here, Luke, a little bit on the pipeline. You guys still have the Keystone Gold Exploration Project in Nevada and also the Chalice Gold Project, Idaho. Any items on this pipeline and any planned work that you want to mention in the near term, or is it all hands on deck for CK to production?
Well, I'll kind of bounce about here, hopefully not too badly, too abruptly, but just sort of wrapping up back on CK is Actually, what we can do at CK and what we are doing, sorry, is focusing in now on further optimizations. So we think there's still a heck of a lot more benefit to the current mine plan than is reflected in the definitive feasibility. So we're doing lots of optimization work there. And another key factoid around the deposit that I completely failed to mention is our waste rock is a very, very high spec granodiorite. It's counted as zero. We've paid for it. We've harvested it in the process of removing the gold and copper mineralization. That rock is being sold 2 miles away by Martin Marietta Materials, a $50 billion NYSE listed company. They're selling that rock down into the Colorado Front Range and out to the West Coast at around $20 to $25 a ton. We've got just under our reserve, we have 40 million tons of that sitting on surface for free. So we're going to find a way to monetize that as well. We'd love to be able to monetize it all front and forward, but even if it just brings down our production costs, where we can use that tonnage to further reduce our mining costs, for example, that kind of optimization is ongoing and is definitely going to be reflected over to the project in near-term reality. Now, getting over to Keystone and Chalice. Keystone, let's go back to the beginning of our conversation. Keystone was our flagship project. Why? Um, it is very hard to put together an entire district in Nevada because land ownership, fractional land ownership, it's a real challenge. That project spent almost 25 years in the process of getting consolidated into a standalone project. We are the first owners of the entire Keystone district. And Keystone used to be, a portion of it used to be owned by Placer Dome, and it was within the realm of their Cortez complex. So Placer Dome famously, of course, owned the Cortez mine, the Cortez district, which is just 10 miles. It's our neighbor. We're the next dome to Cortez. Well, Placer Dome went in there in 2004, made a discovery called Cortez Hills, an underground a pressure pipe actually of about 500 plus feet in diameter, some 300 foot under surface. Took them a while to find it, but they found a 25 million ounce gold endowment with their discovery hole being almost 1,000 feet of an ounce. That's our neighbor. The same rocks, we have the same geology, the very same lithology. It is a remarkable asset, and it completely was ignored, of course, in the last bear cycle. We didn't have the same good fortune as a Great Bear, where we didn't get significant discovery hole while no one was wanting to pay attention to junior mining. So, again, all the assets and all the focus of the company just turned straight to the CK project in Wyoming. Well, now we're in the kind of market where Keystone could and should and most likely will completely dwarf anything that we've managed to achieve over at Copper King in Wyoming. So we feel the directors of the company and a lot of our larger shareholders feel the best use for Keystone now would be to at least explore doing a spin out of that asset. So, record date shareholders receive a share in Newco, call it Keystone Co for sake of argument. We'll go dilute that asset at its own, in its own vehicle, so we don't have to encumber the development of CK with any dilution over at Keystone. But yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest lottery tickets sitting out there in the marketplace right now in the junior scope. Very few people know that story, but I think, in the next 6+ months when we get to talk again, Keystone will be a very prevalent Nevada asset that'll have a lot of excitement around it. Chalice, we're not going to, one at a time. We're junior, so we're going to focus in on Keystone right now.
Appreciate walking us through that. Is there any thoughts just with Keystone here and just the pipeline, with the company moving towards cash flow and obviously excess cash flow to demonstrate not only expansion in Wyoming, but is it still on the table that you guys would look to deploy some of those proceeds from CK operations into continuing to prove up and expand the resources over at Keystone and move that forward? Or is it absolutely we're spinning this out into a separate vehicle?
I shouldn't say absolutely, because as a public company, you can't make those kind of definitive statements and then not follow through for some reason, or change your business approach to it. But what Keystone requires from an exploration standpoint, the kind of dollars, I mean, one could get very lucky and get in there, get into a major find very early, but it's going to require a fair amount of capital. It requires also a more specialized Nevada focused exploration team than what we have under our current executive. Of course, our current executive is engineer and development focused. Even our chief geologist is actually, his career was around mine geology. So having it stand alone, Keystone is not the kind of project I think that a junior would ever be able to develop. Certainly, there's potential there for shallow oxide, a lot like what gold ultimately sold Gold Standard. The Pinion discovery at Railroad, 1.5 million ounces there is what sold Gold Standard. We think there's a very high potential for 1.5 million ounces of oxide. So it is doable as a junior, but it's the deep sulfide targets that requires the big boys. That's a Barrick, or that's a Agnico Eagle, or you name them. That's major fodder. So I think making some significant discoveries there and creating a bidding war on Keystone would be more the approach than wanting to hopefully bring it into the pipeline of production.
Appreciate that. Well said. Thank you for going over that bit, walking us through some of the pipeline and some of that optionality that you guys have here. Well, short of anything else you want to add, why don't we leave it there for this introduction? For potential investors who are listening in, the company has a market capitalization of about 265 million US dollars. Why should US gold be considered within the institutional, family office, and retail investors portfolio at this stage?
Well, if you just look at some of the comps around us, I think we represent some extraordinary potential upside value. I don't think that $265 million is a fair representation of a project of the stature of CK and its where it stands from a development standpoint, where it stands from obviously a reserve and upside standpoint. So, and given the fact that there's an extremely high probability that shareholders of our current company are going to immediately become shareholders of Keystone Corp, or whatever that ends up being called, I think it is absolutely a tremendous time to own US Gold Corp. We maintain a very, very tight share structure. There's no massive dilutionary events on the horizon other than obviously project financing, which generally companies are not discounted for. You actually post raising capital, you get a re-rate on the upside. And I don't think the valuation is even representative of the current value in the asset. So very good time to be taking a serious look at our company, as the definitive feasibility is just starting to be digested by the mining community.
Interesting time and a very good point. We're talking Lassonde curve, et cetera, to get into this company and where the market stands right now as well. And for investors seeking further information, how can they reach the company to ask questions?
Absolutely. Well, again, our website is probably the easiest route. usgoldcorp.com. It has obviously a portal to be able to send us email directly or contact us. There's a telephone number there, of course, online as well. Probably the most direct route for contact with the company, but we are a quick responder. We look forward to incoming, and we love to have contact with our investors and prospective investors.
Luke, really appreciate the time today. And also thank you for coming on to update us on US Gold. We're looking forward to keeping in touch as the company enters the construction phases and coming back again to update.
Thank you, Andrew.